Hello all, today we're going to look at evidence for cultural variability in right-wing authoritarianism factor structure in a politically unstable context by Vilanova et al. It was published in the July 2020 issue of Social, Psychological, and Personality Science. If you'd like to read the article for yourself, check the description down below for a citation and link. Now if you, kind viewer, enjoy appeasing the algorithm gnomes, you can do so by liking and sharing this video, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment down below. Right-wing authoritarianism is a construct that has existed for a few decades now. It was originally conceptualized as a unidimensional personality trait that results from the affinity of three factors: conventionalism, or the reverence for social conventions and traditions; authoritarianism, or aggression directed towards minority or otherwise undesirable groups; and authoritarian submission, or the submission to persons of authority. Now, before I go on, some of you may be wondering if left-wing authoritarianism is a thing. Well, that question is still hotly debated. I went to a symposium at a conference about the possible existence of left-wing authoritarianism, and my understanding is that the disagreement basically comes down to what exactly constitutes an authority. The deaf-a-thing crowd argues that you see some of the same behavioral tendencies on the left as you do on the right, but the sources of authority are different. The not-a-thing crowd argues that since the people the left tends to defer to often don't have much power, they don't constitute an authority. You can continue the discussion in the comments if you'd like. Back to right-wing authoritarianism. Unfortunately, the original measure for this construct was kind of a case study in how not to create a measure. For example, it had a number of what we call double-barreled questions. This question from the original RWA is double-barreled since it is asking about both conventionalism and authoritarian aggression. As such, it can be unclear to the responder what is being asked here. They could maybe agree with the first part of the question, but not the second part. How then should they respond? Overly amalicious questions aside, the original measure has also not held up to the factor structure proposed by the original author. In psychology, when we talk about the factor structure of a measure, we are talking about the subcomponents that, when combined, make our overall measure. When we create a survey, for example, to measure a given construct, we have to operationalize it in certain ways. In other words, we take that grand idea of, in this paper, right-wing authoritarianism, and translate it as a list of things that people who are high in this construct will agree with, and things that people who are low in this construct will disagree with. In this process, we may think of specific subcomponents, or we may not. In either case, we want to do some fancy math stuff to check if there are any subcomponents to the measure. Some measures are only one component, while others have multiple. In the case of the original right-wing authoritarianism measure, it was originally conceived as being unidimensional, or only having one component. Well, in the decades since, other scientists have found that it really has as many as 3 or 4 factors. This inconsistency is not good news for the measure as a whole. So, in a 2010 paper, Duckitt et al. Constructed a new right-wing authoritarianism measure that operationalizes the construct as having 3 dimensions regarding people's attitudes. The first is authoritarianism, or expressing attitudes favoring the use of strict, tough, harsh, punitive, coercive social control versus leniency, indulgence, permissiveness, softness, to violation of social rules and laws. The second is traditionalism, or expressing attitudes favoring traditional, old-fashioned social norms, values, and morality versus modern, liberal, secular, bohemian, alternative values, norms, and morality. And the third is conservatism, or expressing attitudes favoring uncritical, respectful, obedient, submissive support for existing societal or group authorities and institutions, versus critical, questioning, rebellious, oppositional attitudes to them. Under this framing, right-wing authoritarianism can be thought of as an expression of the broader motivational goal of attaining collective security, which arises from social threat and insecurity in general. However, when this measure was cross-culturally translated into a Brazilian context, a 4-factor structure emerged. Authoritarianism and traditionalism remained, but conservatism split into 2. One for the pro-traits, as in pro-us and our authorities, and one for the con-traits, as in contestation of authority. This deviation isn't necessarily surprising. In the modern construal of right-wing authoritarianism as a collection of attitudes, how those attitudes align might very well shift and change depending on the socio-cultural and political context in various countries. Vilanova et al. Therefore sought to understand what might be leading to this splitting of the conservatism factor. They thought it might be due to the recent political instability in Brazil. I don't want to give a big rundown of the recent political history of Brazil, but the short version is that through various internal dynamics, as well as some healthy meddling on the part of the US, they have undergone some rather drastic changes in government. If you want more than that, a number of good channels have done a lot of good work on it, and I encourage you to go down that rabbit hole after this video. Different environments, it is possible that the pro and con items just refer to different things in a politically unstable context, especially since the pro items and the con items might refer to grammatically different subjects. The pro items might refer more to people in charge, whereas the con items might refer more to institutions. On to the present series of studies. The authors used archival data from 2 previously published studies, as well as data from 2 new studies. In total, these studies consisted of over 1,000 participants, and the participants completed the full version of the modern right-wing authoritarianism measure that has been adapted and translated to the Brazilian context. First, the authors conducted an exploratory factor analysis on the data from Study 1, and found 4 factors with eigenvalues greater than 1. Put simply, this analysis found 4 potential dimensions to the measure. These were the 4 factors proposed previously of authoritarianism, traditionalism, contestation to authority, and submission to authority. They then conducted a confirmatory factor analysis in which you check to make sure your model of the measure fits the data. On that same sample, and compared both the 3-factor model and the 4-factor model. They found that the 4-factor structure captured the data much better than the 3. In other words, the measure items fit more neatly into 4 categories than into 3. The authors then repeated the confirmatory factor analysis and comparison on the other samples and found the same results. The 4-factor structure fit the data better than the 3-factor. Furthermore, when the authors examined how the 2 split factors of conservatism might correlate with each other, they found a small to medium negative correlation between the 2. As you might expect, higher scores on contestation to authority were related to lower scores on submission to authority, and vice versa. However, this correlation disappeared when controlling for the other 2 factors. For the longitudinal results, they did some rather fancy analyses that I won't get into here, but suffice to say that they found that the contestation to authority factor is slightly less stable over time than the submission to authority factor. So all in all, I think we have pretty good evidence that in Brazil at least, right-wing authoritarianism might actually consist of 4 separate components. In particular, submission to authority and contestation to authority seem to be 2 distinct behaviors. I think it goes without saying that this differentiation of the conservatism factor might be at least in part due to linguistic differences between English and Portuguese. It may be that something happened during translation that changed the factor structure. In other words, we don't know for sure, just from this paper, if this new factor structure is endemic to the political climate in Brazil or because of various connotational differences between Portuguese and English. As such, future research should examine the factor structure of right-wing authoritarianism in yet more countries, both politically stable and unstable, to assess if this new structure is unique to Brazil or common among other politically unstable countries. Additionally, authoritarianism might be viewed differently by participants residing in democracies compared to autocracies. Well, that's all for now. If you've got a paper you'd like me to read next, or more thoughts on this one, let me know in the comments.